Well, Owen Fairclough is outside the IMF where it's holding its annual meetings. Owen.
Rochelle, I have to confess to you straight up that whenever these IMF reports come out, the inner nerd in me always wants to look for the buzzwords. And this year, in its World Economic Outlook, there are some 130 or so mentions of the word downturn and weak. Compare that with this time last year, and that's a substantial increase. And if that doesn't tell its own story, then the fact that the IMF is starting to compare the precarity of the global economy with those dark days when Wall Street banks were toppling like dominoes before some Eurozone countries started to go bankrupt under the weight of their debt, well, then it all starts to feel just a little bit 10 years ago.
A stark warning from the International Monetary Fund's chief economist.
The global economy is in a synchronized slowdown, and we are once again downgrading growth for 2019 to 3%. Its slowest pace since the global financial crisis.
Just 12 months ago, the IMF was touting what it called steady growth, but trade wars waged by the Trump administration with partners including China have taken their toll and backfired on the US. The IMF sees US economic output falling by 0.5% next year, while China's would fall 2%, though some economists think China's prospects are much better due to reforms.
Policymakers must undo the trade barriers put in place with durable agreements, rein in geopolitical tensions, and reduce domestic policy uncertainty.
Those trade barriers may start to fall after the US and China last week verbally agreed a partial deal to resolve their trade battle. This would improve growth prospects everywhere for the IMF if that deal is signed off.
And that could happen when Presidents Trump and Xi attend the meeting of Asia-Pacific nations in Chile next month. So, Owen, the IMF says if things get worse, some kind of coordinated action would be needed. But what does that mean?
Well, you might remember, Rochelle, that a few hundred miles from here and almost exactly 10 years ago, global leaders, the likes of Barack Obama, Nicolas Sarkozy of France and Gordon Brown, remember him, of Great Britain, all got together to unleash trillions of dollars to basically rescue the global economy in the wake of that financial disaster we were talking about just a moment ago. A true coordinated response that was credited with sparing the global economy from going completely under. And the IMF, in its guarded and fairly coded way, is essentially suggesting that there really isn't that kind of consensus here today, given the political climate, when you have leaders like Donald Trump in the White House putting their countries first. And he's not the only one. We're seeing in the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, who's trying to lead the UK into some form of Brexit. They're concerned with their domestic agendas and how world events affect them, and less concerned with worrying about their neighbours. And that's a concern for the IMF. Should things worsen, they're concerned that there simply isn't that kind of consensus there to put together a coordinated response. Perhaps ultimately it falls to the smaller economies. The IMF talks about the likes of Mexico, Turkey, even Saudi Arabia, that's had its own economic problems over the last few years. Their growth prospects look better, notwithstanding this trade battle between China and the United States, which has been so consuming that should things be resolved, then the IMF suggests that they would add around 1% of the global economy. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in added value should these two countries resolve their trade dispute once and for all. Rochelle.
Certainly a delicate balance. Thank you so much. Owen Fairclough there for us at the IMF.